Hello and welcome to this week's lesson on the Galapagos Islands. I'm going to start with a bit of a recap on last week's learning. So I want you to either, in a brief paragraph form, explain how the Galapagos Islands were formed, or, feeling ambitious, feeling like you want to challenge yourself, draw me an annotated diagram to show how the Galapagos Islands were formed. Remember, annotated means you need to explain what's happening in that diagram fully so that you would make sure that you really can explain it rather than just label. Pause the video. Once you've done that, come back to me. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully, a little bit of a progress check. Hopefully you remembered the Galapagos is formed from tectonic activity. You remembered that it's got a fixed hotspot. It's not on a plate boundary, it forms from a hotspot. This hotspot rises through the crust or the lithosphere. As it rises through, it forms new land. The hotspot is fixed, it doesn't move, it stays in the same place, but we know that the plates do. So because the Galapagos is on the Nazca plate, it is moving towards South America. Because of this, you can see on the second image, the map, that the islands of San Cristobal, for example, are the oldest islands in the Galapagos. The newest islands are Isabella. This is where the new land is continuing to be formed. San Cristobal is effectively an extinct volcano, whereas Isabella is still active, a shield volcano as well. Well done if you got the majority of that. If not, add a little bit of detail. Pause the video if you need to. If not, we'll move on and we'll highlight what we're going to do today. So, what I want to be able to explain by the end of today's lesson is how did the Galapagos Islands, how did they develop from these volcanic landscapes into this such rich, vibrant ecosystem full of plants and animals? It's a bare rock surface when it's formed. It's 1,000 kilometers from the nearest land, plants and animals. So how did it become inhabited? If you're at home on your own, then have a think about this, maybe make a couple of bullet points. If you're in class, discuss this with a partner, or if you've got somebody at home you can talk to, do that. I'm only going to give you 60 seconds, so pause the video and then come back to me. Okay, welcome back. What we're going to do today then is develop that first inklings of understanding that you might have to think about how the Galapagos Islands ecosystems developed. We're going to describe some key features of an ecosystem. Hopefully you've done some of this maybe in science before, or maybe you've done it at Key Stage 2 a long time ago. So we're going to understand what an ecosystem is and some of those key features. Then I'd like to explain how the ecosystem of the Galapagos developed, and there's two key terms here. One is succession and one is colonisation, and really clever geography if we can use those terms. To be secure today, I'd like to then think about how succession and colonisation has led to the formation of complex food webs on the Galapagos Islands, so how they all interact together. And mastered, can you evaluate the impacts of any changes to food webs on the Galapagos Islands? What would happen if something changed? Your skills today are to be able to work collaboratively, and if you're at home, it'll be as an individual. But I want you to show a really strong willingness to learn. It's really interesting geography. So, task one, what is an ecosystem? I've given you a list of key terms. What an ecosystem is. So an ecosystem is the living and non-living components of an environment. And what we mean by that is it's all the plants, all the animals, and all the non-living things that work together to form an environment, whether that be plants, animals, rocks, water, even humans. Habitat is where a particular species may live. Birds live in trees, that's a habitat. Adaptations, how have things adapted to cope in certain ecosystems. Producers, so this is part of an ecosystem. It's an organism that obtains its energy from a primary source such as the sun. So this would be green plants or plankton through the process of photosynthesis. Consumers, they are organisms that obtain their energy by eating another organism. So anything that eats plants or animals is a consumer. Food chain is a line of linkages that put these consumers together. A food web then takes complex food chains and puts them together to make a more complicated version. A scavenger is an organism that consumes dead animals or plants. A decomposer is an organism that breaks down dead animals and plants like fungi or bacteria. Colonisation is the action of a plant or an animal establishing itself in an area. Succession, I haven't got the term there, but succession is where a particular type of plant grows initially on a location, and over time it develops the right conditions for more plants and animals to live there. Alien species are animals that are not natural to an ecosystem, often introduced by humans. I'm going to give you a minute. Look at those terms and try and remember them. Pause the video, come back to me when you have. Okay, so welcome back. If you're working from home, your task now is to provide a definition for those 11 phrases. Don't look back at the terms. If you're in class, your job now is, with a partner, try and describe each of those different terms linked to an ecosystem without looking back at your notes. Once you've done that, I want you to think about which processes have to occur first for an ecosystem to develop. Pause the video, come back to me when you've done that. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully you're feeling pretty confident with some of those terms there, and hopefully you are happy with some key ideas that have been introduced. More than this, I'd really hope that you've understood that actually for an ecosystem to develop in the first place, we need plants and we need animals, and that's the process of succession and colonisation. So what I'm going to do is show you a brief video to explain how this happens. All you need to do is watch and take it on board.
Deep in the ocean, tectonic activity causes lava to burst from the seabed. This is known as a lava plume, and as the lava makes contact with the cool seawater, it cools and solidifies into volcanic rock. When this breaks the surface, a new island is created. The newly formed island is utterly devoid of life. The arrival of plants and animals to a new island such as this is known as colonisation. How do species arrive on such a desolate island in the first place? Well, some species arrive by wind, or they fly to the island. Other species may float on natural rafts of vegetation and arrive at the islands by luck, or they may swim to the islands. The process of transforming a bare island into a complex ecosystem is known as succession. The first to arrive on the scene of a newly formed island are the pioneer species. These are often plants. They're hardy and resilient, and unlike many other species, they require few nutrients and are adapted to survive with minimal water. Let's look at lichens as an example. Spores are blown over from the mainland. Lichens are able to survive in the harsh terrain and start to break down the rock, forming soil. The creation of soil means that more resources are available for other small resilient plants to grow. Grasses and flowering plants are then able to grow well as the soil becomes more and more fertile. Succession reaches its destination with a climax community. This sort of community is characterised by bigger trees, such as Scalasia. Now that plant life is established on the once empty island, animals are able to start colonising. Some insects and birds are blown over from the mainland, with help from the wind. Other species, such as small lizards, can reach the islands by floating on rafts of vegetation. With their ability to survive weeks without food and water, even giant tortoises are able to float across this expanse of ocean. Sharks and marine mammals such as sea lions can swim to the islands. not all plants and animals that arrive become successful colonisers. Living conditions must be just right. Colonisers need to have the right habitat, sufficient food supply, enough water, and the ability to reproduce. Physical capabilities and a degree of luck have determined the wildlife we now see in Galapagos. What will you discover?
Okay, so hopefully that makes some sense, because your task now is, if you're in class, to annotate this image, start to explain how the Galapagos ecosystem began to develop. And I've given you a lot of key terms there to use and explain. The challenge would be, can you explain how the pioneer species create perfect conditions for intermediate species? If you're working from home without the worksheet, then make a quick sketch of that diagram and do the same task. Pause the video, come back to me when you've done that. Okay, welcome back. Our next task is to then think about, if we now know how plants and animals arrived at the Galapagos, then actually, how do they now interact? It's that interrelationship aspect of geography, how things depend on each other. And one of the key things there is food chains and food webs. Here's a food chain. It's a very simple one, and it's not associated with the Galapagos. You can see, though, that all food chains start with something green that can photosynthesize, because the energy comes from the sun. That's the producer. In this case, it's grass. The primary consumer, the first consumer, is a grasshopper. It eats the grass. The second consumer, is the bluebird. It eats the grasshopper. The snake, the tertiary consumer, tertiary means third, eats the bluebird. The apex predator is the owl. The owl eats the snake. And what the apex predator means is it's a predator that does not have a predator in that ecosystem. So the owl does not have a consumer. When the owl dies, it gets decomposed, though, by fungi, mushrooms, or bacteria, which then support the growth of more grass. So you can see how a food chain is really interconnected. Something more complex than a food chain is a food web. And here's another example of one. Here you can see how there's a variety of food chains. We can see that we start with shrubs in one, and it goes to the rabbit eats the shrubs, but then the mountain lion eats the rabbit. However, the rabbit's got another predator. That's the snake. The snake eats the rabbit too. The snake is then eaten by the hawk and the mountain lion. So food webs are a more complex version of food chains. On the next slide are a selection of plants, flora, or animals, fauna, known or found on the Galapagos Islands. I would like you to create a terrestrial, which is a land-based food chain, and a marine-based food chain using those images provided. Mark on the terms producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, and apex predator. Think through which animals you would find on land, which animals you would find in the sea. Pause the video, come back to me when you think you've got your food chains correct. Okay, welcome back. Little extension for you. Can you create a mixed food chain using these animals? So can you create a food chain that may work between the marine and the terrestrial? And a real extension challenge would be, can you create a more complex food web? Pause the video. When you've done that, come back to me. Okay, welcome back. Let's check your understanding. For the terrestrial, you should have had that the prickly pear cactus is the producer. This would be eaten by the pink land iguana, and then the Galapagos banded snake eats the iguana, eaten by the Galapagos hawk, and that's your apex predator. For the marine, you should have the green sea lettuce, that is photosynthesizing and creating energy, which is eaten by the razor surgeon fish, which is then eaten by the grouper, the Bacala grouper, which is then eaten by the whale shark. If you were to make a combined one from all of those animals, you would have a green sea lettuce being eaten by the razor surgeon fish, which is then eaten by the blue-footed booby, the bird, which eats fish, which is then eaten by the vampire finch. But the Galapagos hawk is still at the top. It's still the apex predator. So our final task today, our extension. Here's a combined food chain stroke web showing land and sea ecosystems in the Galapagos. All I'd like you to do is to consider what would happen if there were some changes. So firstly, the flying fish became extinct. What would the impact of this be on the Galapagos ecosystem? Pause the video, make a note, come back to me when you have. Okay, welcome back. There's a couple of impacts. Firstly, in the marine ecosystem, your bacalhau grouper would actually have nothing to eat. So that would become extinct, meaning that the razor surgeon fish would become extinct. However, the plankton and the green sea lettuce would have more to eat. The land would be affected because the blue-footed booby would have less things to eat, which means that would have a negative impact on the vampire finch. There'd be less of those. Because there's less of those, then the Galapagos hawk would have to eat more banded snake. If they eat more banded snake, that's good for the land iguana because it then has one less predator. What would happen if the Galapagos banded snake increased in population size? Pause the video, make a note, come back to me. Okay, so the Galapagos banded snake, there's more of them. That's bad news for land iguanas. That's bad news for vampire finches. They've got more predators. Because they've got more predators, that means that there is probably more prickly pear cactus being maintained on the island because less land iguanas to consume those, and the blue-footed booby will increase because the vampire finch isn't there to eat the blue-footed booby. This is also good news for flying fish because the blue-footed booby, or bad news, sorry, for the flying fish because the blue-footed booby, there's more of those, and then it has an impact on the marine ecosystem. Finally, one last one. If there was an introduction of an alien species, remember an alien species is a species that is not known naturally in a location, such as the Florence downsy. It's a type of fly from South America. Lays its eggs in birds like the vampire finch, leading to a significant decrease in the population of these birds. What would the impact be? Pause the video, come back to me. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully you've got the idea by now. If the vampire finch decreased in numbers because of the introduction of an alien species, then there'd be less predators of the blue-footed booby. Less predators of the blue-footed booby means an increase in that primary consumer there, but that's bad news for flying fish. So that is actually good news for the bacalhau grouper. But equally, the vampire finch is extinct, which means that the Galapagos banded snake will have to increase its predator nature with the land iguana, which is bad news for that. What this shows is how ecosystems, how food chains are so interconnected and how fragile they are. If one thing changes, then the potential for the whole ecosystem to collapse is there. And it's why we have to be really careful as we manage ecosystems moving forwards. So, hopefully by the end of today's lesson, you should feel comfortable describing some of the key features of an ecosystem. You should be able to explain how the Galapagos developed with colonisation, and hopefully you now can understand how food webs have developed on the Galapagos Islands. Further to this, you now should be able to understand how food webs are very complex but very fragile and very easy to collapse. To finish then, here is another slide, an explanation of the Galapagos Islands ecosystem. I think it's really useful for you to now go back to those key objectives, those outcomes, and consider if there is any areas you might need to improve or develop your understanding. Well done today, and I'll catch you next time.